They laughed when she stepped off that stage. A full-figured woman in a worn burgundy dress, carrying one battered trunk into the bitter Montana wind. And that was all they saw. They didn't see the quick, quiet eyes moving across every broken corner of the dying ranch. They didn't see the worn leather ledger hidden in her bag, carrying 50 years of knowledge no one on that property possessed. They didn't see the mind already calculating, already solving, already seeing the shape of something salvageable in the ruins everyone else had stopped looking at. 22 men were slowly starving. A ranch was weeks from collapse. A winter was coming that showed no mercy. And the only person who knew how to stop all of it was the woman they had already decided was nothing. This is the story of Mabel Holloway, who arrived with one trunk, rebuilt what everyone had abandoned, and proved that the most dangerous thing in any room is a woman the world has underestimated. If this story moves you, hit like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mabel's story travels, because some stories deserve to go the distance. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you see people forever. The wind came down from the Rockies like a warning. It rolled across the open grasslands of the Montana Territory in long, cold waves, bending the dry autumn grass flat against the earth, rattling the fence posts, and carrying with it the sharp, iron scent of an early winter, one that threatened to arrive weeks ahead of schedule. The sky above Black Ridge Ranch had turned the color of pewter by mid-afternoon, heavy and low, pressing down on the valley as though the land itself were being slowly crushed beneath it. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of the porch and watched the horizon and said nothing. He was 34 years old, and he looked older. 6 years of drought, bad markets, and harder luck had carved deep lines into his face, lines that belonged on a man of 50. His jaw was strong, his shoulders broad, but there was something worn about him now, something that hadn't been there when he first broke ground on this land. His dark coat was mended at both elbows. His boots, once fine, were cracked along the seams. He held a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, but he didn't drink it. He wasn't thinking about coffee. He was thinking about the number 22. 22 men. That was how many hands were currently sleeping, eating, and depending on Black Ridge Ranch for their survival. 22 men who had stayed through the worst years because Rowan had asked them to, because he had promised them that things would turn around, that the ranch would recover, that patience would be rewarded. 22 men who were now looking at a pantry that held barely 3 weeks of provisions and a winter that showed no mercy. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. His foreman, Dale Hutchins, stepped out. Dale was a lean, weather-beaten man in his late 40s, with a long jaw and eyes that had seen too many hard seasons to be surprised by anything. He came to stand beside Rowan without being asked and looked out at the same horizon. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "She'll be here on the afternoon stage," Dale said finally. His voice was flat. Not unkind, but flat. Rowan nodded slowly. "I know. Men are talking. I know that too." Dale turned to look at him. "Rowan, you sure about this?" Rowan turned the cold coffee cup in his hands. He wasn't sure about anything. He hadn't been sure about anything in a very long time. But certainty was a luxury he could no longer afford. What he had instead was desperation wearing the thin disguise of a plan. "I'm sure about one thing," Rowan said quietly. "We don't make it through winter the way we are. Not enough food. Not enough money. The Hargrove Bank holds the note, and Hargrove isn't a patient man. Marrying some woman you found through a newspaper ad isn't exactly—" "I know what it is," Rowan cut him off. Not harshly, but with the quiet finality of a man who has already had this argument with himself many times and lost every round. "It's not romantic. It's not what I planned for my life. But if there's any chance she brings resources, connections, anything, then I have to try." Dale looked at him a moment longer, then turned back to the horizon. "Just hope she's sturdy," he said. "Frontier doesn't care about good intentions." The stage arrived 40 minutes late. By the time the horses came clattering down the rutted road toward the ranch gate, half the crew had drifted to the yard with the casual, studied nonchalance of men who were absolutely, deliberately pretending they weren't waiting. They stood near the water trough, near the barn doors, near the fence, scattered but watching, every one of them. The stage rolled to a stop in a small cloud of dust and dead leaves. The driver climbed down and opened the door. And then Mabel Holloway stepped out of that coach and into the Montana wind and Black Ridge Ranch got its first look at its new bride. She was not what they expected. She was not what anyone would have expected, if the men were being honest, which, in that moment, most of them weren't, because honesty would have required them to examine exactly what it was they had expected, and the answer would not have reflected well on any of them. Mabel Holloway was a full-figured young woman in her mid-20s, with a round, pleasant face and dark brown eyes that moved quickly and quietly across everything they landed on. She wore a practical traveling dress in a deep burgundy wool, worn at the hem but carefully pressed. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a simple hat. She carried one trunk, a single battered trunk that the driver wrestled down from the roof of the coach, and a small leather satchel over one arm. She stood in the yard and looked at the ranch, not at the men watching her, not at Rowan, who was walking toward her with his hat in his hands. She looked at the ranch, at the fence lines, at the barn roof where 2 planks had been replaced with boards of a different color, at the garden beds that had been left to go to seed, at the smokehouse at the far edge of the property, half hidden behind the grain shed, its door hanging off one hinge. She looked at all of it with those quick, quiet eyes, and her face gave away nothing. "Miss Holloway." Rowan stopped a few feet away and gave a short, stiff nod. "I'm Rowan Mercer. We corresponded." "We did," she said. Her voice was calm and even, with a slight warmth that surprised him. She extended her hand, not waiting for him to offer his. "It's good to put a face to the letters, Mr. Mercer." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. Behind him, he could hear the murmurs. "She's heavier than I figured. Mercer's gone and married a cook instead of a wife. She won't last a week out here. Look at her." Rowan's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. Mabel, for her part, gave no sign that she had heard anything at all. She simply looked back at the ranch, then at Rowan. "You have a smokehouse," she said. He blinked. Of all the things he had prepared to say, welcoming remarks, explanations about the ranch, apologies for the state of things, he had not prepared for that. "An old one," he said, "behind the grain shed, hasn't been used in years. The man who built it died before I bought the property." She nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she had already suspected. "I'd like to see it," she said. "I can show you the house first, get you settled." "The smokehouse," she said again, gently but without any flexibility in her tone. "If you don't mind." Rowan Mercer stared at his new wife for a moment. Then he put his hat back on his head and said, "This way." The smokehouse was in worse shape than even Rowan had let himself acknowledge. Standing in front of it now, in the thin October light, with Mabel at his side, he could see how thoroughly he had managed to ignore this corner of the property for the past 6 years. The door was not merely off its hinge. It was rotted half through at the bottom and warped so badly it no longer fit the frame. The exterior walls, built from rough-hewn pine, had gone gray and soft in places where weather had found its way in. Inside, the stone firebox was intact, but choked with old ash and debris. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams, black with years of smoke and rust. The air inside smelled of old char and dust. Rowan watched Mabel walk into that ruin and look around with an expression that was not dismay, was not despair, was not the faint nausea he himself felt when he really looked at it. She looked interested. She walked the perimeter of the small interior slowly, running one hand along the stone of the firebox, tapping the walls with her knuckles, examining the ceiling beams and the rusted hooks with careful attention. She crouched down and looked at the floor, brushed some debris aside with her boot. She stood. She looked at the doorframe. She looked at the chimney opening. She opened her satchel and took out a small leather notebook, worn almost soft as cloth, its cover dark with age and handling, and began writing something in it. "What is that?" Rowan asked. "My father's ledger," she said, without looking up. He kept every smokehouse technique he ever used or learned. Every curing formula, every temperature, every cut of meat, and how long it takes to do right. 3 generations of knowledge. She turned a page. His father started it. He added to it. I've been adding to it since I was 12 years old. Rowan looked at the little notebook in her hands, and then at the ruined smokehouse around them, and felt, for one brief and disorienting moment, something he had not felt in a very long time. Something that might have been hope. He killed it quickly. He'd learned not to trust that feeling. "The door needs replacing," he said. "The firebox needs clearing. The wood's gone soft on the western wall." "I can see that," Mabel said pleasantly. I'll need hardwood for the smoke. Oak and hickory if you have it, cherry if you don't. Salt, a considerable amount, more than you probably think necessary, and I'll need access to whatever meat stores you have and to the slaughter schedule. Rowan frowned. Miss Holloway. Mrs. Mercer, she corrected him mildly and looked up from the notebook. We are married, after all. He stopped. He hadn't thought of it quite that way yet. The ceremony had been brief and procedural, conducted in the county seat 3 days prior, with 2 witnesses he barely knew before she'd taken the stage north. He'd thought of it as paperwork more than anything else. She was watching him with those calm, dark eyes, not pushing, not demanding, just waiting. You said you'd need a considerable amount of salt, he said, because it was the easiest thing to say. We're already running short on provisions. I'm not sure I can... How short? She asked. He paused. He didn't want to tell her the truth. He had barely been telling himself the truth. But something about the directness of her gaze made evasion feel somehow worse than honesty. 3 weeks, he said quietly. Maybe 4 if we stretch it. Mabel was silent for a moment. She looked around the smokehouse one more time, slowly, and then she closed her notebook and put it back in her satchel. Mr. Mercer, she said. Rowan. The use of his name was deliberate, he sensed, a gentle recalibration of the distance between them. If you can get me what I need and give me 2 weeks to work, I can feed your men through winter. Not just 3 weeks, all of it. I can preserve enough meat to carry 22 men through to April. He looked at her. You understand I have no reason to believe that, he said. Not cruelly, just honestly. I know, she said. But you have no better option, do you? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. Mabel picked up her satchel, settled it over her arm, and turned toward the open door and the cold afternoon light beyond it. I'll make you a list tonight, she said, of what I need. We can go over it in the morning. She paused at the doorway and looked back at him over her shoulder. And Rowan, the salt isn't a luxury. It's the whole foundation. Don't let the cost of it make you hesitate, because hesitating now will cost you everything. She walked back toward the house. Rowan stood alone in the ruined smokehouse for a long moment, looking at the rusted hooks and the dead ash in the firebox, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the doubt, that small, stubborn feeling flickered again. He still didn't trust it. But he didn't kill it this time either. That evening, the bunkhouse was alive with conversation that Mabel was not meant to hear. She heard it anyway. The walls of the ranch house were thin, and the bunkhouse was close, and the men had apparently decided that distance and darkness granted them a kind of privacy they did not actually possess. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open before her, making her list by lamplight, and their voices drifted through the cold air with startling clarity. Seen her come off that stage. That was Cooper, one of the younger hands. Barely 20, with a quick mouth and even quicker opinions. Big woman, don't see how she's going to last out here. Mercer's desperate. An older voice, probably Hatch, the grizzled hand who had been on the property longer than anyone else. When a man's desperate, he makes desperate choices. She wasn't what I pictured when he said he was bringing in a wife. Cooper again. A short laugh. Thought maybe she'd be, I don't know, different. What she's going to do? A third voice. Young, uncertain. He said she'd help? How's she going to help? She looks like she's never worked a day outside in her life. Women like that, Cooper said, and the certainty in his voice was the particular certainty of someone who has never been wrong because he has never examined his assumptions. They're used to soft lives. She'll see what real work looks like, and she'll fold inside a week. Then Mercer's stuck with a wife, and nothing's changed. Mabel looked down at her list. She did not stop writing. Her handwriting was precise and steady. Her father had taught her that a shaking hand produced sloppy measurements, and sloppy measurements produced ruined meat, so she had trained the shake out of her hand young, and it had never come back. She thought about her father, his thick hands, patient and sure, the way he'd shown her how to read the color of smoke, how to smell the difference between a good cure and a spoiled one, how to press a piece of meat and tell by its resistance alone whether it had been in the brine long enough. She thought about the years she'd spent at his side, in their own smokehouse back in Ohio, learning the work that other people thought too humble to bother with, too unglamorous to respect. She thought about the way people had always looked at her and decided, before she'd opened her mouth, what she was capable of. She added another item to her list. Oak. Minimum 40 pounds. Outside, Cooper was still talking. I give her a month, he said. Tops. Mabel underlined oak twice because she'd learned that emphasis on paper prevented arguments in person. Then she turned the page and kept writing. The list she presented to Rowan the next morning was 2 pages long, written in her careful hand, with quantities noted precisely and reasons provided for each item without being asked. Rowan read through it at the kitchen table with his coffee. Hot, this time. While Mabel sat across from him with her own cup, watching his face with the unhurried patience of a woman who had learned to let numbers speak for themselves. He read slowly. His frown deepened as he went. He paused. This is a significant outlay. Salt alone is the most critical component of preservation, she said. Without adequate salt, the curing process fails. Without curing, the meat spoils. Without preserved meat, your men go hungry in February. The salt isn't optional. I understand the principle, he said, a slight edge in his voice. What I'm trying to communicate is that we don't have the funds. I know, she said. I've been thinking about that. He looked up. She reached into her satchel and set a small tin on the table between them. She slid it toward him. He looked at it, then at her, and opened it. Inside were coins. Not a fortune. He could see that, but more than he'd expected. Gold and silver, neatly arranged. My savings, she said simply. Every dollar I put aside over the past 3 years. It's enough to cover the initial supplies with a small amount left over. Rowan sat very still. I can't take your savings, he said. You're not taking anything, she said, and her voice was patient but precise. I'm investing in the operation that I am now a part of. This is my ranch too, Rowan, by law and by marriage. I don't intend to watch it fail when I have the means to help prevent that. He looked at the tin for a long moment. There was something deeply uncomfortable about it. A man of his era and background, accepting money from a woman, letting her carry a weight he felt he should have been able to carry himself. He was aware of the discomfort. He was also aware that his pride had very nearly starved 22 people, and that the time for comfortable feelings had long passed. He closed the tin. I'll go into town Friday, he said quietly. Get what's on the list. Mabel picked up her coffee cup. Thank you. He looked at her across the table and tried to find something to read in her face. Judgment or satisfaction or the kind of hidden triumph that people usually couldn't fully conceal when they'd won a negotiation. He found none of those things. She was just sitting there, quietly, drinking her coffee, already thinking about something else. Already, he suspected, thinking about the smokehouse. Mrs. Mercer, he said. She looked at him. Why? He asked. And he meant all of it. Why here? Why this place? Why a dying ranch with a man she'd never met, and 22 strangers who'd already decided she was a failure? Why give her savings to a problem she hadn't created? Mabel set her cup down. She thought for a moment, looking at the window and the gray morning beyond it. My father used to say, she said slowly, that a smokehouse is either alive or it's a ruin. There's no middle state. You either tend it or you abandon it, and abandonment is a kind of decision too. It just doesn't feel like one until it's too late. She paused. I think that's true of most things worth having. She looked back at him. I didn't come here to let something die that doesn't have to. Rowan Mercer had no answer for that. He nodded once, stood, and went to put on his coat. The work began the following Monday. Mabel rose before dawn, not demonstratively. She didn't make noise about it, didn't announce it, didn't seek an audience. She simply rose in the dark, dressed in her oldest and most practical clothes, built up the kitchen fire, drank her coffee, standing at the counter with her father's ledger open beside her, and then walked out into the freezing pre-dawn air and went to the smokehouse. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. The plan was in the ledger, and in her head, and in the memory of her father's hands guiding hers through the same work 20 years ago. She just needed the materials, the space, and the time. The first 3 days were pure labor. She cleared the smokehouse herself, shoveling out years of accumulated ash and debris, scrubbing the stone of the firebox until the old soot came away in sheets, treating the remaining wood with a mixture she'd brought in her trunk specifically for this purpose. She worked alone and quietly, declining the 2 offers of help she received with a simple, "Thank you, but I've got it." That didn't invite argument. On the fourth day, she began the structural repairs. This was where she asked for help. Specifically, she asked Dale Hutchins, who turned out to be a capable carpenter, when something actually needed doing. She showed him precisely what was needed: a new door, cut to her measurements, a replacement section of the western wall, reinforcement of the smoke vents at the roof. Dale listened with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression, and then he did exactly what she asked without further comment, which Mabel decided immediately made him one of the more sensible people on the property. By the end of the first week, the smokehouse stood solid and sealed against the wind, its new door fitting true in its frame, its firebox cleaned and ready. On the 8th day, she lit the first fire. She used a small amount of the hickory she'd selected from the woodpile, chosen by hand piece by piece, for density and dryness, and coaxed the flame up slowly, feeding it with the patience her father had taught her, reading the smoke as it began to rise. Thin and blue at first, then thicker. Then, as the wood settled into its burn, it thinned again to a pale, clean ribbon that she could almost see through. She stood in the doorway of the smokehouse in the gray morning light and watched the smoke climb into the cold air above the ridge of the roof, and she felt something settle in her chest, some long-held tension releasing itself. There you are, she thought. There you are. It was a private moment, and it lasted perhaps 30 seconds before she turned back to the firebox and got to work. What the men noticed first was the smell. It was impossible not to notice. By the end of the second week, when Mabel had the operation running with the first real batch of cured meat hanging in the smokehouse and a second batch already in the brine, the scent of hardwood smoke and curing meat had begun to drift across the entire property with a richness that was almost physically affecting. Cooper noticed it first, coming back from the north fence line with 2 other hands. He stopped walking mid-stride, lifted his head, and sniffed the air with an involuntary expression of pure animal interest. "What is that?" he said. "Smoke," said the man beside him, unnecessarily. "Not just smoke," Cooper said. He couldn't articulate what was different about it, the depth of it, the complexity, the way it carried something more than just burning wood. "That's something else." By the time Mabel brought the first finished product to the dinner table, a tension had been building in the bunkhouse for days that nobody had quite named, but everyone had felt. A shift in the way the men talked about the woman in the smokehouse, a gradual erosion of certainty in the opinions that had been so freely expressed the first week. They filed in for dinner as usual, and they sat down, and Mabel set the platters on the table without ceremony and stepped back to the kitchen door. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of reluctance. It was the silence of people who have put food in their mouths and found themselves suddenly, unexpectedly confronted with something that exceeded every expectation they brought to the table. It was the silence of men who hadn't eaten well in months, maybe years, suddenly remembering what it felt like when food was not just fuel, but something more. Cooper took a second piece before he'd finished the first. He looked at it as he chewed, as though he expected to find the explanation for what he was tasting hidden somewhere in the texture of the meat. He did not find it. Hatch set his fork down and looked toward the kitchen, where Mabel had retreated. He picked his fork back up. He didn't say anything, but something in the set of his jaw had shifted. At the head of the table, Rowan ate slowly and said nothing. But when he looked toward the kitchen, his expression was not the polite, wary gratitude of a man acknowledging a gesture. It was something more complicated. Something between surprise and the beginning of recalibration, like a man realizing he has been reading a map wrong and trying to quietly work out where he actually is. Later, when the men had filed back to the bunkhouse and the table had been cleared, Rowan found Mabel in the kitchen, writing in her ledger by lamplight. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "Mrs. Mercer," he said finally. She looked up. "That was..." he started, and then stopped because the sentence didn't have a good ending that didn't sound like more than he was prepared to offer. He tried again. "The men ate well tonight." Mabel looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "They did." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to say, I think..." He stopped again, cleared his throat. "I underestimated you." It was not an easy thing for him to say. She could tell by the way he said it. The slight stiffness, the controlled quality of the words, like a man reading aloud from a document he wasn't sure how to feel about. Mabel looked at him for a moment, and then she looked back down at her ledger. "We have enough for the first 2 weeks of preservation," she said, her pencil moving again. "If the slaughter goes as planned next Monday, I'll have the main winter store finished by end of November. I'll need the salt delivery before then. Remind Dale to confirm the freight date." Rowan blinked. "Of course," he said. He stood there another moment, and then he went away, and Mabel sat alone at the kitchen table in the lamplight, writing in her father's ledger, and the faint smell of hickory smoke still clung to her hair and her coat. And somewhere outside, across the cold Montana night, the smokehouse, cooling slowly in the dark, held its first season's promise in the curing dark. She turned a page and kept working. The frontier does not hand anything to anyone. It takes and takes until you find the one thing it cannot take from you, and then you build everything else from there. For Mabel Holloway Mercer, that thing was knowledge. Quiet, patient, unshakable knowledge, worn smooth as river stone by years of use, passed down through careful hands, and now, finally, put to its full purpose. But knowledge alone had only just begun its work at Black Ridge Ranch. The smokehouse was burning, the meat was curing, and winter was coming. The cold came early that year, as if the Montana sky had grown impatient with autumn and decided to skip straight to the worst of what it had to offer. By the third week of October, the ground had frozen hard enough that footsteps rang against it like struck iron, and the breath of every man and animal on the property hung in white clouds that dissolved slowly in the still, brittle air. The mountains to the west had gone white to their mid-slopes. The river that ran along the eastern boundary of Black Ridge Ranch had narrowed to a dark thread between banks of pale ice, and at night, the temperature dropped so far below freezing that the water in the horse troughs had to be broken with a mallet each morning before the animals could drink. The men worked with their collars up and their hats pulled low, moving between chores with the economical, slightly hunched motion of people conserving warmth. Conversation grew shorter. Laughter grew rarer. The bunkhouse, already crowded, became the one place where the cold could be held at arm's length, and men who had bickered freely in warmer months found themselves tolerating each other with a quiet, pragmatic solidarity born of shared misery. Through all of it, before any of them rose, and long after most of them had gone to sleep, the light in the smokehouse burned. It was the first thing visible from the bunkhouse windows in the pre-dawn dark. A thin line of amber beneath the smokehouse door, and above the roof, the slow, pale ribbon of smoke climbing into the black sky. The men had stopped remarking on it after the first few days, the way people stop remarking on the steady sound of a creek once they've lived near it long enough. It simply became part of the landscape of the ranch, as fixed and reliable as the mountains. But they noticed it. Every one of them noticed it, even when they pretended not to. Mabel worked on a schedule that would have exhausted a person half again her size and 10 years her junior, and she kept to it with the unbroken, almost mechanical consistency of someone for whom discipline had long since ceased to be a choice and become simply a way of being. She was up at 4:30 each morning. She stoked the smokehouse fire first, checking the temperature by feel and smoke color before she checked anything else, a habit so ingrained she could not have said when she'd acquired it. She monitored the hanging cuts, pressing, smelling, adjusting the airflow through the vents with the careful precision of a physician adjusting a patient's medication. She turned brined meat in the curing barrels by hand, recorded temperatures and times in her ledger with entries as spare and exact as a surveyor's measurements. She managed the salt ratios with a vigilance that bordered on obsession, because she knew, as her father had taught her, and experience had confirmed, that salt was not a seasoning. Salt was a contract with time. Too little and the contract broke. The meat spoiled, everything spoiled. Between smokehouse visits, she ran the kitchen. This was the part that surprised the men most, because they had unconsciously filed smokehouse work and kitchen work into separate categories, outdoor and indoor, physical and domestic, and had not fully processed that Mabel was doing both simultaneously without apparent strain. Breakfast appeared on the table every morning, hot and ready, at the same time it always had. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been in years. Supplies that Rowan had assumed were nearly depleted turned out to have been reorganized and rationed so efficiently that what he'd thought was 3 weeks of provisions was, under Mabel's management, closer to 6. It was Dale Hutchins who first said it out loud. He came into the kitchen one morning, looking for Mabel to ask about the smokehouse door. It was sticking in the cold, warping slightly against the new frame. and found the kitchen empty. Breakfast on the table, coffee hot on the stove, and a note on the counter in Mabel's precise hand that read, "In the smokehouse. Back by 6. Coffee's fresh. Door sticking. Plane the bottom edge a 1/4 inch." Dale stood in the kitchen and read the note twice. Then he poured himself a coffee, sat down at the table, and said to no one in particular, "She already knew about the door." Hatch, who was sitting at the far end eating his breakfast, looked up. "She knows about everything," Hatch said, and went back to eating. It was not said with admiration exactly. Not yet. But it was said without the dismissive edge that had characterized most conversations about Mabel in the first week, and that, on Black Ridge Ranch in late October of 1883, was its own kind of progress. The change in Cooper took longer, and it happened in a way that Cooper himself was not immediately aware of. He was 20 years old, and he had the specific confidence of a young man who has been told he is capable so many times that he has never developed the habit of questioning his own assessments. He wasn't cruel. Cruelty requires a kind of active intention that Cooper had never bothered to develop. He was simply certain, in the easy, unexamined way of youth, that he understood how the world worked and where people fit within it. He had decided on the day Mabel stepped off the stage that she would not last. He had been waiting, with the patient readiness of someone anticipating a confirmed outcome, for the signs of her failure. The cold would wear her down. The work would expose her limitations. The gap between what she'd promised and what she could deliver would eventually become impossible to ignore. What he had not accounted for was the smell. It was a particular quality of the smoke from the Black Ridge Smokehouse that seemed designed, almost deliberately, to dismantle defenses. It carried in the cold air differently than regular wood smoke, deeper, more layered, with something beneath the sharpness of burning hickory that was almost sweet, almost savory, that hit the back of the throat and communicated something directly to the oldest, hungriest part of the brain without consulting the opinions or the certainties of the part that made judgments about people. Cooper noticed one afternoon, coming in from the eastern pasture with numb hands and a mood to match, that he had unconsciously altered his route back to the bunkhouse to pass closer to the smokehouse. He stood outside it for a moment in the fading light, listening to the low sound of the fire inside, breathing the smoke-laden air, and he felt something shift in him that he couldn't have named if he'd tried. He didn't try. He went inside and ate dinner. But the next morning, he took the same route past the smokehouse without needing a reason for it. Rowan watched all of this from a careful distance. He was not by nature a man given to dramatic reassessment. He made decisions slowly, changed his mind reluctantly, and was suspicious of anything that felt like enthusiasm, because enthusiasm had led him wrong before. Bad investments, misplaced trust, optimism in the face of evidence that should have given him pause. He had come to prefer the steadier, lower-lying feeling of cautious wait-and-see over the volatile peaks of hope. But Mabel was making it very difficult to wait and see. He found himself, in the second week of her operation, standing outside the smokehouse in the early morning dark, listening to the sounds from inside. The low, steady crackle of the fire, the occasional movement of her footsteps on the plank floor, the faint scratch of her pencil in the ledger, and feeling the same disorienting shift he'd felt the night she'd presented that first dinner, amplified now by 2 weeks of daily evidence. She had said she could feed 22 men through winter. At the time, it had sounded like the kind of promise people make when they need to be believed, and don't yet know the full weight of what they're promising. Now, watching the smokehouse operation take shape with methodical, unhurried competence, he was beginning to understand that she had said it because she had calculated it, because she had known, from the moment she'd looked at the empty pantry and the abandoned smokehouse and the hard Montana sky, exactly what was possible and exactly what it would take. She had known before he had. She had known when no one else had known, and she had said nothing about it except what was necessary, and then she had gotten to work. He knocked on the smokehouse door one morning, which felt strangely formal given that it was, by legal definition, also his smokehouse. Mabel's voice came back without delay. "Come in." Inside, the warmth was immediate and enveloping after the bite of the outdoor cold. The fire in the stone box burned low and even, and above it, in the upper half of the structure, rows of curing meat hung from the iron hooks in the rafters. Cuts of beef and pork that had been Mabel's negotiated additions to the slaughter schedule argued for calmly and one without drama. The air was dense with smoke and the complex layered smell of the cure. Mabel was at her work table, a plank bench she'd had Dale build against the south wall, writing in her ledger. She looked up when he came in. "How's it looking?" Rowan asked, because it was better than saying what he actually wanted to say, which was something along the lines of, "I think I've been wrong about several things, and I don't entirely know how to address that." "On schedule," she said. She turned the ledger so he could see the page, columns of dates, weights, temperatures, notes in her small, precise hand. "This batch will be ready to move to the cold store by end of next week. I've started the second batch already. It's in the brine." She nodded toward the barrels along the north wall. "The third batch I'll start the day after the second comes out. By mid-November, I'll have enough hanging that we can bank the smokehouse fire to a lower level and let time do the rest of the work." Rowan looked at the columns of figures. He had a reasonable grasp of arithmetic and a good working knowledge of the ranch's needs, and what he was looking at told a story that he hadn't expected to be reading in late October. They were going to make it through winter, not just survive it, actually, genuinely, mathematically, make it through. "Mabel," he said. She looked up. He wanted to say something adequate to the situation. He searched for it and came up empty, the way a man sometimes does when the thing he wants to express is larger than the words he's learned to use. "You weren't," he started. "When you said you could do this, you meant it." Mabel looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I always mean what I say," she said simply. Not harshly, just as a fact, the way she stated most things. "I know that now," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at her ledger. "The salt supply is going to run close in the third week of November," she said. "I'd like you to put in a second order before then, before the freight road gets difficult." "I'll do it Friday," he said. "Thursday would be safer?" He almost argued. He stopped himself and said, "Thursday." She nodded and wrote something in the ledger. He stood there another moment in the warm, smoke-thick air, and then he went back outside into the cold, and something in him that had been wound tight for a very long time unwound, just slightly, like a rope releasing a fraction of its tension. It was not yet trust, not the full, unconditional weight of it. But it was the beginning of something that would become trust, and that was more than Black Ridge Ranch had seen in years. The middle weeks of November brought with them a particular kind of frontier hardship that tested not just bodies, but the subtler, less visible resources of human beings: patience, steadiness, the quiet management of fear. 2 horses came down sick within the same week, requiring Rowan and Dale to spend long days and short nights nursing them in the barn. A section of north fence line collapsed under the weight of an early snowfall and needed immediate repair in temperatures that made every task twice as difficult and half as effective. One of the younger hands, a boy of 17 named Ellis, who had joined the crew in the spring, cut his hand badly on a fence wire and developed an infection that kept him in the bunkhouse for 10 days, frightened and feverish, being checked on twice daily by Mabel, who had also, apparently, brought with her a working knowledge of wound care and the particular astringent mixture that eventually drew the infection out and spared the boy his hand. Ellis would speak of Mabel with a reverence from that point forward that made the other men slightly uncomfortable with their own earlier opinions. It was during this dense, difficult middle stretch of November that the incident with the ledger occurred, the moment that, more than any other single event, changed the quality of the atmosphere on the ranch in a way that could not be undone. Mabel had left her father's ledger on the kitchen table one afternoon while she went to check on the smokehouse. She had been in the habit of leaving it there during the day, since the kitchen was her primary workspace indoors, and the ledger moved between the 2 locations with her. But on this particular afternoon, she was delayed by a problem with the smokehouse ventilation. Ice had built up in the upper vent and was partially blocking the draw, a problem she'd anticipated in the ledger but hadn't expected quite this early in the season. And she was gone longer than she'd planned. Cooper came in from the afternoon chores looking for coffee and found the ledger lying open on the table. He should have left it alone. He knew he should have left it alone. He poured his coffee, sat down at the table, and stared at it for a full 30 seconds before his curiosity overrode his better judgment, and he turned it toward himself to look. The page it was open to was dense with text and diagrams. A detailed entry about smoke temperature ranges and their effects on fat rendering, with small penciled illustrations of airflow patterns inside a smokehouse, annotated with temperatures and times. Below it, a table of brine concentrations for different cuts of meat, with notes on seasonal adjustment. Below that, in slightly different handwriting, older, the ink more faded, what appeared to be the same information in a slightly different form, as if a second person had added to the first person's entry, comparing notes. Cooper frowned. He turned back a page, then another. The ledger was, he gradually realized, not just a recipe book. It was a record of decades of work, of specific problems encountered and solutions developed, of techniques refined through repeated trial and documented with the careful, empirical attention of people who understood that knowledge not written down is knowledge that dies. Some entries were in a hand he'd come to recognize as Mabel's, small, precise, modern. Others were in the older hand of someone who wrote with a slight leftward lean. Still others were in a third hand, rounder and less practiced, that appeared mostly in the early pages. 3 generations of knowledge. She had said that the first day. He hadn't known what she meant. Now he was sitting at the kitchen table in the cold Montana afternoon, turning the pages of a document that represented 50-odd years of a family's accumulated expertise that had been carried across half the country in a battered trunk and applied quietly and without fanfare to saving his life and the lives of 21 other men. And he felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He had said she'd fold inside a week. He had said it to other men, confidently, as though it were simple observation rather than judgment dressed up as fact. He had said it about a woman who had been doing this work, in some form or another, since she was a child. The smokehouse door opened and Mabel came in, pulling her coat off in the relative warmth of the kitchen. She stopped when she saw him sitting at the table with the ledger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Cooper looked at her. She looked at the ledger, then at him, and her expression was unreadable. Not angry, not hurt, not triumphant, just watching. "I'm sorry," Cooper said. "I shouldn't have. It was on the table, and I—" He stopped. He pushed the ledger toward her. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time it carried a different weight, and both of them knew it wasn't entirely about the ledger. Mabel crossed the kitchen and picked up the ledger. She looked at the open page for a moment, running her thumb along the edge of it, and then she looked at Cooper. "My grandfather started this," she said quietly. "He learned from a man who'd been smoking meat since before the war. My father learned from him and kept adding. I've been adding to it since I was 12. She closed the cover gently. "It's not magic. It's not a secret. It's just work that someone cared enough to write down." Cooper looked at his coffee cup. "You've been doing this your whole life," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And we—" He stopped, tried again. "I said some things when you first got here. About you. Things I shouldn't have said." "I heard them," Mabel said. He winced. "I know." She looked at him for a moment with those level eyes, and then she went to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her back to him, "I've been heard those things my whole life. From people who decided what I was capable of before I opened my mouth. I stopped letting it slow me down a long time ago." She turned around. "What matters to me isn't the opinion. It's the work. The work doesn't lie." Cooper sat with that for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "No, it doesn't." Mabel sat back down at the table across from him and opened her ledger to the page she'd been working on before. She picked up her pencil. Cooper finished his coffee. Neither of them said anything else, and yet something had shifted between them. Some weight had been set down by one and acknowledged by the other, and the kitchen felt different afterward than it had when he'd walked in. That evening at dinner, Cooper was the one who carried the serving platter from the kitchen to the table without being asked. Mabel noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The smokehouse, meanwhile, was becoming its own kind of wonder. By the 3rd week of November, the operation had reached the scale Mabel had planned for from the beginning. The hanging racks were full, the cold store was stocked with the first cured batches wrapped and labeled in Mabel's hand, and the steady production of preserved meat had begun to do what she had promised it would do. It had removed, from the daily arithmetic of life at Black Ridge Ranch, the low, constant, grinding anxiety of not enough. It was remarkable how much space that anxiety had taken up, and how much clearer everything looked once it was gone. The men ate better, they slept better. The conversations in the bunkhouse grew less tight, less brittle, and the humor, real humor, the kind that comes from people who feel safe enough to be funny, began to return, cautiously at first, and then with more ease. Rowan noticed it. He noticed it the way a man notices the absence of a pain he has lived with so long he'd forgotten it wasn't normal, only recognizing what it had been once it was no longer there. He came to the smokehouse one evening near the end of November, not with a question or a concern, but simply because he'd found himself walking in that direction and hadn't found a good reason to stop. He knocked, came in, and found Mabel standing at her work table with the ledger open and a cup of tea at her elbow, making her end-of-day entries by the light of 2 oil lamps. She looked up. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Everything's fine." He looked around the smokehouse, at the hanging cuts, at the organized barrels, at the neat stack of hardwood beside the firebox. "I just wanted to, He stopped. "I don't know why I came in." Mabel looked at him for a moment. "You can just come in," she said. "You don't need a reason." He stood there in the warm, smoke-scented air and felt the truth of that land somewhere in him. This was his smokehouse, his ranch. And this woman, this quiet, precise, tireless woman who had appeared out of nowhere with a battered trunk and a dead man's ledger and saved every person on this property from a winter that would have broken them, this woman was his wife. He didn't quite know what to do with all of that yet. But standing in the warm light of the smokehouse while the cold pressed against the walls outside, he thought that perhaps not knowing was all right. Perhaps not knowing was just the beginning. "Tea?" Mabel asked, already reaching for the second cup she kept on the shelf. "Yes," Rowan said. "Thank you." He sat down across from her at the work table, and she poured the tea. And outside the wind moved across the frozen Montana Valley, and inside the smokehouse the fire burned steady and low, and the cured meat hung in the dark above them like the promise of a winter they were now, for the first time, prepared to survive. The December cold settled over the valley like a held breath, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself with wind or storm, but simply arrived one morning and refused to leave, pressing down on every surface, turning the world to iron and glass. The creek along the eastern boundary had frozen completely now, solid enough that the horses could have walked across it, and the sky on clear days was that particular shade of pale blue that exists only at high altitude and low temperature, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Black Ridge Ranch moved through it differently than it had moved through any previous winter. There was something in the quality of the men's movements, less hunched, less tight, less marked by the invisible weight of people managing a fear they couldn't name. The cold was the same cold. The work was the same work. But the pantry shelves held food, real food, and the cold store behind the main house was stocked with Mabel's cured meat in quantities that the men had stopped being surprised by and started simply being grateful for. That shift, from surprise to gratitude, was its own quiet landmark in the life of the ranch. Mabel noticed it the way she noticed most things, without comment, from the corner of her eye, while doing something else. She had settled into the rhythms of the place now with the ease of a woman who understood that belonging to somewhere is not a feeling that arrives all at once, but accumulates, like curing, slowly through time and salt and patience. She knew the names and habits of all 22 men. She knew which ones took their coffee black and which ones took it with sugar, and which one, Ellis, still sheepish about the infection and the fevered days she'd sat with him, now left a small piece of firewood on the kitchen step each morning as a wordless offering of gratitude. She knew which section of the north fence rattled in the northwest wind and which hinge on the barn door needed oil every 3 weeks, and the particular sound the smokehouse fire made when the wood was burning at the right temperature versus when it was running too hot. She had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the operational center of the ranch. This was not something Rowan had planned or Mabel had demanded. It had simply happened the way real things tend to happen, through the steady accumulation of demonstrated competence, until the idea of things functioning any other way became difficult to imagine. When a decision needed to be made about provisions, people asked Mabel. When there was a question about the schedule, people checked with Mabel. When something broke or ran short or went wrong, the first question in the bunkhouse was no longer, "What does Mercer say?" but "Does Mabel know about this yet?" Rowan was aware of it. He watched it happen and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The ranch was functioning better under this arrangement than it had in 6 years. His pride was not worth more than 22 men's welfare, and he was at least wise enough to know that. What he had not anticipated, what no one on the ranch had anticipated, was the smell. The same rich, complex smoke that had drifted across the property and worked its quiet transformation on the men of Black Ridge had also, in the manner of smells, refused to respect property lines. It moved with the wind, carrying itself into the neighboring valleys and over the ridge lines, arriving at other ranches and homesteads and way stations with the insistence of a message that demanded to be read. The first stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December. Mabel was in the smokehouse checking the third batch, running her hands along the hanging cuts with the focused attention of a physician on rounds. When she heard hoofbeats in the yard, she didn't immediately leave what she was doing because whatever was in the yard could wait 30 seconds while she finished her assessment. When she emerged, she found a lean, weathered man in his late 40s sitting on horseback in the center of the yard, looking around with the frank, evaluating gaze of a man accustomed to judging operations on sight. Dale Hutchins was standing near the water trough with his arms crossed, regarding the stranger with the cautious neutrality he applied to most unexpected arrivals. "Can I help you?" Dale said. The man on horseback looked at the smokehouse, at the thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney into the pale December sky, and then at Mabel, who had appeared in the smokehouse doorway with her ledger tucked under one arm and a businesslike expression on her face. "That your smokehouse?" the man asked. He addressed the question to the space between Mabel and Dale, in the habitual manner of someone who was not yet sure which of them was in charge. "It is," Mabel said, because it was, and because leaving that question unanswered had no benefit she could identify. The man looked at her with the flicker of recalibration that she had grown accustomed to, that slight hesitation when reality didn't match the expectation. He recovered quickly. "Name's Garrett," he said. "Foreman at the Sulphur Creek operation, about 12 miles south. We've been smelling your smoke for better than a week." He paused. "I'll be direct, ma'am. We've got 30 men and a beef supply that isn't going to see us through March. I was wondering if there was any possibility of purchasing preserved meat from this operation." Mabel looked at him steadily. She had thought about this possibility. She had thought about it carefully, in the specific mathematical way she thought about most things, sitting at her work table in the smokehouse during the quiet early morning hours when the fire was banked low and the ranch was still asleep. She had thought about current capacity, about what the ranch's own needs required through April, about what a surplus might look like, and what a fair price for it would be, and what the logistics of delivery across 12 miles of winter road would entail. She had done all of this thinking in the abstract, in the privacy of her own mind and her own ledger, because turning it into a conversation with Rowan had felt premature. She had wanted to wait until she had the numbers firm before she proposed anything. The numbers, as of that morning's assessment, were firm. "How much meat are you looking at?" she asked. Garrett blinked. He had expected to be told to talk to the man of the ranch. He adjusted with the practical adaptability of a man who had spent his life on the frontier and understood that the frontier didn't wait for your expectations to catch up with reality. "We'd need enough to supplement our current stores through March. 40, maybe 50 pounds of finished product to start. If the quality holds, we'd want a standing arrangement." Mabel was quiet for a moment. She opened her ledger to the page she wanted without looking. Her fingers knew the book's geography the way her feet knew the floor plan of the smokehouse in the dark. She looked at the figures. She ran them against what she knew. She looked up at Garrett. "We can do 40 pounds, she said. "Delivery in 2 weeks, once the current batch finishes. The price is 12 cents a pound for standard cuts, 15 for the premium brisket. If you want a standing arrangement through March, I'll need a deposit against the second delivery before we begin the third batch." Garrett stared at her. "That's a fair price," he said, after a moment, and he sounded slightly surprised by his own assessment. "It is," Mabel agreed. "You got a figure in mind for the deposit?" 20% of the projected total order. I can have an exact figure written up for you by end of day, if you want to come back." Garrett looked at her for another long moment, and then he looked at Dale, who was watching this exchange with an expression that had slowly traveled from cautious neutrality to something approaching awe. Then Garrett looked back at Mabel. "I'll come back this afternoon," he said. "I'll have the paperwork ready," she said. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and turned his horse around. Mabel watched him go, then turned back to the smokehouse without any particular display of satisfaction, because satisfaction was a feeling best examined in private, and there was still work to be done on the third batch before she could afford to step away. Behind her, Dale Hutchins stood in the yard for a long moment. Then he went to find Rowan. Rowan was in the barn when Dale found him, working on a bridle that had been needing repair for 2 months. He looked up at Dale's expression, that particular set of Dale's jaw that meant something unexpected had occurred and he was still processing the implications, and put the bridle down. "What happened?" Rowan said. Dale told him. Rowan listened without interrupting. When Dale finished, Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he put on his coat and walked across the yard to the smokehouse, and he knocked and went in. Mabel was at her work table, already writing. She looked up when he came in. She could see in the set of his face that Dale had talked to him, and she could see something that was not quite anger, more like the expression of a man who has discovered the game has changed and is trying to decide how he feels about it. "You negotiated a commercial order," he said, "without talking to me first." Mabel set her pencil down. "The man arrived this morning," she said. "The opportunity was immediate. Waiting to consult you would have meant losing the order, because men like Garrett don't wait. They move on to the next option. This is my ranch." "It's our ranch," she said. Her voice was even, without sharpness, but the distinction was clear and deliberate. "By law and by marriage, which you agreed to." She paused. "And I wasn't negotiating on behalf of myself. I was negotiating on behalf of the operation we both depend on." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. "You should have come to me," he said. "I should have," she said. "In a perfect situation, with more time, I would have. But I want to show you something before we continue this conversation." She turned the ledger around on the table so it faced him and slid it toward him. He looked down at it. The page showed 2 columns of figures, the ranch's current debt obligations and projected income, on the left and on the right. The same figures adjusted for the addition of the Sulphur Creek order, and 2 additional projected orders of similar size, if the operation could sustain them. He looked at the right-hand column for a long time. The ranch's primary debt, the note held by the Hargrove Bank, the one that had been keeping Rowan awake since spring, appeared in the right-hand column with a projected payoff date, not years away, months. He looked up. "How long have you been running these numbers?" he asked. "Since the first week," she said. "Since I understood what the smokehouse could produce and what the market in this valley was likely to bear. I didn't say anything because I wanted the production numbers to confirm the projections before I raised a possibility that might not materialize." She looked at him steadily. "I don't like to promise things I'm not certain I can deliver." Something moved across Rowan's face that was complicated enough that it would have taken a longer acquaintance than they had to fully read. It was part chagrin, part recognition, and underneath both of those things, something that bore a resemblance to the particular feeling a person gets when they realize they have been standing in front of the answer to their problem and looking past it. 12 cents a pound, he said. 15 for the premium brisket, she said. He was quiet. That's solid pricing. It's fair pricing, she said. Fair to both parties. Garrett knows it too. That's why he agreed without negotiating down. If the price isn't fair, you don't build a lasting arrangement. You build a single transaction, and then the man goes somewhere else. She paused. We want the arrangement. Rowan sat down across from her at the work table. He picked up the ledger and read the figures again, more slowly this time. She let him read. She poured tea from the pot on the small shelf behind her and set a cup beside his elbow without being asked, and went back to writing while he read. After a while, he set the ledger down. I owe you an apology, he said. For this morning, or in general? She asked, without looking up from her writing. The question surprised a short, low sound out of him. Not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it, the first spontaneous sound she had heard from him that wasn't measured and controlled. He caught it quickly, but she caught it first, and she allowed herself one small, private smile directed at her ledger page. Both, I suppose, he said. She looked up. You were operating with the information you had, she said. I don't hold that against you. What I ask is that going forward, you operate with the information I give you. All right, he said. She nodded and went back to writing. He sat there for a moment longer, looking at her. This woman he had married for practical reasons, and was now discovering had more dimensions than he had allowed himself to look for. Mabel, he said. She looked up. When Garrett comes back this afternoon, he said carefully, I'd like to be here. Not to... He seemed to choose his words with unusual deliberateness. Not to take over the conversation. I'd like to be here as a witness, to learn how you do it. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. This was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected him to want to be present in order to resume control, to reassert his position as the man of the ranch, to find some face-saving way to manage the transition from the conversation they'd just had. She had been prepared for that. She had not been prepared for this. All right, she said, be here at 3. He was there at 2:55. Garrett returned as promised, and the conversation that followed was the first time anyone on Black Ridge Ranch witnessed Mabel Holloway Mercer operate at the full height of her capability. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It bore no resemblance to the kind of confrontational, table-pounding negotiation that men in that era associated with serious business. What it was, instead, was a masterclass in the quiet exercise of comprehensive knowledge, the kind of negotiation that happens when one party understands the numbers, the logistics, the market, and the other party's position better than the other party does, and chooses to use that advantage not to extract maximum concession, but to build a structure both sides would actually keep. Mabel had the figures written out in 2 copies, one for Garrett, one for her ledger. She walked him through the pricing with the calm clarity of someone explaining a mathematical proof. Here are the inputs, here's the process, here's the result, and here's why it is fair. She addressed the deposit question before he raised it, which told him she had thought about his position as well as her own. When he pushed, mildly, on the delivery timeline, she didn't move. She explained, specifically and without condescension, why 2 weeks was the minimum, what the curing process required, and what would happen to the quality of the product if that timeline was shortened. Garrett stopped pushing. When he left, 20 minutes later, with the written agreement folded into his coat pocket and the deposit figure agreed upon, he paused at the smokehouse door and looked at Mabel with an expression that was frank and unguarded in the way expressions sometimes are when a person forgets to perform their usual version of themselves. I've dealt with a lot of suppliers in a lot of territories, he said. You know your business better than most men I've sat across a table from. Mabel met his gaze. I know my business better than most people I've sat across a table from, she said. The relevant quality is knowledge, Mr. Garrett, not the person who holds it. Garrett looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, with a definitiveness that suggested he was filing something away for future reference, and went out into the cold afternoon. Rowan had stood near the door through the entire exchange, as he'd said he would, but present but not intervening, watching. When Garrett was gone, he looked at Mabel and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Well, Rowan said finally. Well, Mabel agreed and turned back to her work table. He crossed the smokehouse in a few strides and stood looking at the written agreement she'd produced, the clean, precise document she'd drafted that morning before Garrett's second visit, in handwriting that was, he'd come to understand, a reflection of her entire way of operating, careful, deliberate, leaving nothing to interpretation. You wrote this before he came back, Rowan said. I wrote it this morning after he left the first time, she said. I knew what the terms would be, I just needed to confirm he'd come back. And if he hadn't? Then I'd have used it as the template for the next person who came, she said simply. Someone else would have come. The smoke doesn't stop at our property line. He looked at her. How many more orders do you think you can take on? She opened her ledger to a fresh page. That depends on 2 things, she said. How quickly we can scale the operation, and whether you're willing to invest in the expansion. What kind of expansion? A second firebox in the smokehouse. More hanging capacity. I can show you the design. And we'd need to increase the slaughter schedule, which means negotiating with the 2 homesteads to the north for additional cattle at a price that works for both sides. She glanced up at him. I've already drafted a proposal for that as well. Rowan stared at her. You drafted a proposal? He said. Last week, she said. I wanted to have it ready when the moment came. She paused. The moment came a little sooner than I expected, but the document holds. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the December wind moved against the smokehouse walls, and the fire in the stone box crackled low and steady, and the cured meat hanging in the rafters was the physical embodiment of everything that had changed at Black Ridge Ranch in the 6 weeks since Mabel Holloway had stepped off a stagecoach with one trunk and a dead man's ledger and seen, in an abandoned smokehouse that everyone else had walked past for years, the shape of what could be saved. "Show me the expansion design," he said. She turned another page in the ledger and laid it flat between them on the work table. He leaned over it. She leaned over it. Their shoulders were close in the warm, fire-lit air. Outside, the wind made its cold argument against the walls, and neither of them paid it any attention. They were looking at the design, at the careful lines and measurements and notes in Mabel's hand, and talking through it with a focused, mutual seriousness that was its own kind of language, the language of two people who have stopped performing their positions and started simply working together. It was, in its undemonstrative way, a turning point. Neither of them named it as such. There was no moment of declaration, no ceremony, no exchange that said, "This is the moment things changed between us." There was only the work table and the firelight and the ledger open between them, and the gradual recognition arrived at separately, from different directions, at slightly different speeds. That the careful distance they'd been maintaining was no longer necessary, and had, perhaps, never been. Mabel would make a note in the ledger that evening, after Rowan had gone back to the house, and she was alone with the fire and the hanging meat and the cold pressing against the walls. December 8th. Expansion proposal accepted. Second firebox to begin construction week of the 15th. First external order confirmed. Sulphur Creek, 40 pounds. Delivery, December 22nd. Anticipate second inquiry within the month based on current smoke range and wind patterns. Then beneath the entry, in writing slightly smaller than her normal hand, as if she wasn't entirely sure it belonged in the ledger, but couldn't find a better place for it, Father would have said, "The smokehouse is alive again." He would have been right. She closed the ledger. The fire burned low. The wind moved outside, carrying the smoke south across the valley, past the frozen creek, over the white ridge line, into the dark winter air where it would travel as far as the wind allowed, telling anyone with the sense to pay attention that something was happening at Black Ridge Ranch. Something had been lost for a long time, and now it was being found. The second firebox went in during the 3rd week of December, and the construction of it became, without any deliberate intention, the first project at Black Ridge Ranch that everyone worked on together. It started with Dale, who had drawn up the stonework plan from Mabel's specifications, and needed 2 extra sets of hands to set the foundation. Cooper volunteered before he was asked, which surprised Dale enough that he didn't comment on it, sensing correctly that commentary would only complicate something that was better left simple. Ellis joined them the following morning, his healed hand moving carefully but steadily, carrying mortar and stone with the quiet determination of someone who understood, in a personal and specific way, what he owed this operation. By the 4th day, 3 other hands had drifted in to help, drawn not by any instruction, but by the particular magnetism of a project that clearly mattered, and by the awareness that the smokehouse had become the center of everything worth preserving on this ranch. Mabel moved around the construction with her ledger and her measuring tape, checking dimensions with a precision that brooked no approximation, and the men worked to her measurements without argument, which would have been unimaginable 6 weeks earlier and now simply felt like the correct way to do things. Rowan watched from a middle distance and felt something he couldn't immediately name. A feeling that was not quite pride, because pride implied ownership of something, and what was happening in front of him did not belong to him. It was more like the feeling of witnessing something that had always had the potential to exist finally becoming itself. His ranch, his crew, and the woman he had married out of desperation, all operating together with a coherence that he had not built and could not take credit for, but that was real and functional and growing. The second firebox was completed on December 20th, 2 days before the first Sulphur Creek delivery. Mabel inspected it the morning after the mortar cured, running her hands along the interior stone the same way she ran her hands along the hanging meat, with focused, tactile attention reading through her fingertips. She lit a small test fire and watched the draw. She adjusted one of the upper vents by a quarter turn. She lit the fire again, watched the smoke, and nodded once. "It'll do," she told Dale. Dale, who had spent 4 days in freezing temperatures laying stone to her exact specifications and was deeply invested in the quality of the result, exhaled a breath that he had apparently been holding. "High praise," he said dryly. "It's perfect," she said, and went back to work. Which, from Mabel, was the highest praise available, and Dale understood that too. The Sulphur Creek delivery went without incident. Rowan and two hands drove the wagon the 12 miles south on the morning of December 22nd, and Garrett received the product with the careful assessing attention of a man examining a business relationship he was considering committing to seriously. He pressed the cuts, smelled them, sliced a thin piece from one, and chewed it slowly with an expression of concentrated evaluation, and then he looked at Rowan with his head slightly tilted. "You tell your wife," Garrett said, "that this is the finest cured product I've tasted in 20 years of running operations in this territory." Rowan thought about the correct response to this. "I'll tell her," he said. "She'll appreciate the assessment." "She ought to," Garrett said. "Tell her also that I've spoken to two other foremen who are interested in the arrangement. She can expect visits after the new year." On the ride back to the ranch, Rowan sat on the wagon bench in the clear, cold afternoon and turned that information over in his mind with the slow, thorough attention it deserved. Two more potential orders. Sustained through the spring, that kind of revenue would not just settle the Hargrove note. It would leave the ranch in the strongest financial position it had occupied since he'd first broken ground here. He thought about the woman who had made this possible, who had arrived with one trunk and a worn-out ledger and seen, in the ruins of an abandoned smokehouse, the entire structure of a solution that no one else had been capable of seeing, who had invested her own savings without being asked, who had worked before dawn and after dark for 6 weeks without complaint or credit, who had sat across a table from a stranger and negotiated a fair price with a competence so complete it had left an experienced frontier foreman visibly surprised. He thought about the day she'd arrived, and the things the men had said, and the things he himself had privately thought, and he felt a quality of discomfort that was not entirely unpleasant, the specific discomfort of a person recalibrating against better information, recognizing not just that they were wrong, but understanding, at some depth, how the wrongness had been constructed and maintained. He drove back to the ranch in the thin winter light, and when he arrived he went directly to the smokehouse and told her what Garrett had said, word for word. Mabel listened with her arms crossed and her head slightly bowed, in the posture she adopted when she was receiving information and processing it simultaneously. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "2 more," she said. "After the new year," Garrett said. She turned to her ledger, already moving. "I'll need to adjust the production schedule for January. If both orders materialize at the same scale as Sulphur Creek, we'll be running both fireboxes at capacity." She turned a page. "We'll also need to revisit the cattle negotiation with the northern homesteads. I'd like to do that before the orders arrive, so the supply is confirmed before we commit to delivery timelines." "I can ride out there this week," Rowan said. She looked up. "Take the proposal I drafted," she said. "It's in the left pocket of the ledger cover. Don't go below the figures on page 2. That's the floor. If they push, point to the delivery guarantee on page 3. It protects them as well as us, and that's a real benefit, not a negotiating tactic." Rowan looked at her. "You want to come with me?" She considered it. "Not this time. They'll be more comfortable negotiating with you directly. You have the existing relationship with the Harmon family, and introducing too many new elements in a single conversation clouds the proposition." She paused. "But go over the figures with me tonight before you go, so you understand the reasoning behind every number. I don't want you in that conversation without knowing why the floor is the floor." He nodded. He did not feel diminished by these instructions. This had surprised him initially. The first time she'd given him direction rather than asking permission, some old, stubborn thing in him had stiffened. But the feeling had lasted about 30 seconds before the more rational part of his mind had pointed out that her instructions were always correct, and that the feeling itself was a habit rather than a principle, and habits could be changed when principles demanded it. "Tonight, then," he said, "after dinner." She was already writing. The new year arrived with a week of storms that shut the valley down entirely. 3 feet of snow in 48 hours, winds that turned the air white and directionless, temperatures that killed 2 of the weaker cattle on the Harmon homestead to the north, and confirmed, for everyone in the valley, that this was a winter being deliberate about itself. Black Ridge Ranch moved through the storms without crisis. The cold store held, the smokehouse burned, the men were fed, the horses were sheltered. There was a quality to life on the ranch during those storm-locked days that was different from any winter the older hands could remember. Not comfortable, exactly, Because Frontier winter is never comfortable, but sustainable in a way that had not felt guaranteed before. They played cards in the bunkhouse and argued about things that didn't matter, and ate Mabel's cooking and the preserved meat from the smokehouse. And not one of them went to bed hungry. And that fact sat in the room with them like an unspoken understanding between people who know what the alternative looks like. The two foremen Garrett had mentioned arrived within a week of each other in early January, once the storms cleared and the roads were passable again. The first, a taciturn man named Bryce, who ran a large operation 40 miles to the east, arrived with a practical directness that Mabel appreciated. He knew what he wanted, had a general sense of what he was willing to pay, and was primarily interested in confirming quality before committing. She gave him a sample from the current batch, walked him through her curing process with the same systematic clarity she'd used with Garrett, and let the product make its own argument. Bryce ate the sample, chewed it twice, swallowed, and said, "What's your capacity?" By the time he left, they had the outline of an agreement. The second visitor was more complicated. His name was Aldridge, and he managed supply for a territorial freight company that serviced a dozen ranches and outposts across a 200-mile range. He was a different kind of man from Garrett or Bryce, city-educated, formally dressed for the frontier, with the smooth, practiced manner of someone who had spent years negotiating from a position of structural advantage. He arrived with a smile that was professionally calibrated, and a set of terms that were, on examination, considerably less favorable than they appeared on first reading. Mabel read his proposed terms twice at the work table, while he sat across from her with his hands folded and his expression pleasantly patient. The expression of a man who was accustomed to people agreeing to things they hadn't fully understood. She set the document down. "Your pricing structure," she said, "builds in a margin on the resale that effectively cuts our revenue by 30% relative to direct sale at the same volume." Aldridge's pleasant expression didn't change. "The value we offer," he said smoothly, "is distribution reach. Access to markets you couldn't service independently. The margin reflects that value." "I've looked at your distribution territory," Mabel said. 12 of the 14 ranches in your network are within 40 miles of this operation. We could service 10 of those directly with our own delivery." She opened her ledger to a page she'd prepared before his arrival. "I've mapped it out." Aldridge looked at the page. Something moved behind his pleasant expression, a slight recalculation, quickly concealed. "Direct delivery at that scale would require significant investment in your transport capacity," he said. "It would require 1 additional wagon and 2 additional drivers," she said, "which, at the margins your proposed contract offers us, would pay for itself within 4 months. She turned the ledger so he could read the figures. "I've done the arithmetic." He read the figures. He was, whatever his other qualities, a man who understood numbers, and what the numbers told him was that the woman sitting across from him had done her homework more thoroughly than he had done his. "You're a careful businesswoman, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his tone had shifted, still smooth, but the smoothness now had a different quality, the quality of a person who has stopped performing and started actually talking. "I'm a precise one," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "What would a revised arrangement look like from your perspective?" "A distribution partnership at flat fee rather than margin percentage," she said. "You take a set amount per delivery for the logistics, and we retain the full revenue on the product. That gives you predictable income independent of our pricing, and it gives us control over our margins." Aldridge was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his own document, then at her ledger, and the arithmetic of both told the same story from different angles. "You've clearly thought about this longer than I've been here," he said. "Since before you arrived," she said. "I knew someone from the freight networks would come eventually. I wanted to be ready for the conversation." Something changed in Aldridge's face then. The final layer of professional performance dropped away, and what was underneath it was simply a man who had encountered something he hadn't expected and was deciding how to respond to it with integrity rather than habit. He sat back in his chair. He looked at her without the studied pleasantness, without the negotiating posture. Just looked at her the way one professional looks at another, when they've stopped pretending the meeting is anything other than what it is. "All right," he said. "Show me the flat fee structure." She showed him. They spent the better part of 2 hours at the work table, going through it. Real negotiation this time, neither side pretending, both sides working toward a structure that would actually function. When they reached agreement, Aldridge drafted the revised terms in his own hand and signed them, and Mabel signed them, and he folded his copy into his coat with a thoughtfulness that was different from the way he'd arrived. At the door, he paused. "Where did you learn to negotiate?" he asked. It was a genuine question, carrying no edge. "From my father," she said. "He said the purpose of a negotiation isn't to win. It's to build something that doesn't fall apart after you leave the room." Aldridge considered that. "Smart man." "Very," she said. He left. Mabel sat back down at the work table and looked at the signed agreement in front of her, and allowed herself, in the privacy of the empty smokehouse, 1 full minute of something that was not quite celebration. She didn't celebrate, as a rule, until the delivered product confirmed the promise, but was its closest neighbor. She was writing up the agreement summary in her ledger when she heard the hoofbeats of a different kind of horse approaching the ranch, a single horse, moving at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, but had the deliberate quality of an official errand. She noted it in the way she noted most things, filed it, and kept writing. It was Dale who knocked on the smokehouse door 20 minutes later, and the expression he wore when he came in was one she hadn't seen on his face before, something between uncertainty and a careful, withheld excitement. "There's a man," Dale said. "Arrived about a quarter-hour ago. He's been walking the property with Rowan, looking at the cold store, the smokehouse from outside, the operation generally." He paused. "He's got a territorial inspector's seal on his saddlebag." Mabel set her pencil down. "Did he say what he's here for?" she asked. "He said he received reports about an unusual food preservation operation in the valley, said he's been receiving them from more than one source." Dale looked at her. "Mabel, I've been on this ranch for 11 years. I've never had a territorial inspector come here for anything other than a tax complaint or a grazing dispute." He paused again. "He doesn't look like he's here for a complaint." Mabel closed the ledger. She straightened her work apron, which was her only concession to the fact that a stranger had arrived and she would shortly be meeting him. She picked up the ledger and her pencil and tucked them under her arm. "Where are they?" she asked. "Coming across the yard now," Dale said. She walked to the smokehouse door and opened it. The inspector was a man in his late 50s named Whitfield. She would learn his name in the next few minutes, compact and self-contained, with the unhurried bearing of a man who had spent decades examining things and had long since stopped being surprised by them. He walked beside Rowan across the frozen yard, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes moving across the property with a methodical sweep that missed very little. When he saw Mabel in the smokehouse doorway, he stopped. Rowan stopped beside him and looked at Mabel with an expression that was carefully neutral but contained underneath its surface. The particular tight quality of a man who was very aware that something important was happening and was determined not to interfere with it. "Mrs. Mercer," Whitfield said. He nodded at her with the specific formality of a man performing an official function. "I'm Territorial Supply Inspector Arthur Whitfield. I've been receiving accounts of this operation from several sources across the valley. I was in the territory for an inspection at the Hargrove facility and thought it warranted a personal visit." "You're welcome to see everything," Mabel said. She stepped aside from the doorway. "Come in." What followed was 2 hours that Mabel would remember afterward as one of the most precisely satisfying experiences of her working life. Whitfield was not a man who gave compliments. She understood this within the first 10 minutes, recognizing in him the particular type of professional whose standard of evaluation is so high that approval manifests not as praise, but as sustained attention. When Whitfield stopped looking at something and moved on, that was his version of it being insufficient. When he stayed, when he looked longer, touched more carefully, asked more questions, that was his version of recognition. He stayed a long time in the Black Ridge smokehouse. He examined the stone fireboxes, both of them, the original and the new, with his hands as well as his eyes, reading the construction the way a craftsman reads another craftsman's work. He looked at the hanging cuts and asked her about temperature ranges and curing times, and she answered each question with the quiet, systematic completeness of someone for whom these facts are not memorized but understood. The difference between a student reciting answers and a practitioner explaining reasoning. He examined her brine barrels. He asked about salt concentration. She told him, gave the reasoning, referenced 2 specific entries in her father's ledger and showed him the pages, and he studied them with an expression of undisguised professional interest. He tasted the product at 3 different stages of cure, chewing slowly and deliberately each time, and said nothing after any of them except to ask one precise follow-up question per sample, which she answered, and he nodded and wrote something in his own small notebook. He looked at her records, the ledger, the entries, the temperature logs, the weight records. With the focused attention of an accountant examining a balance sheet, he hadn't expected to find this clean. He turned pages slowly. He asked about her notation system. She explained it. He looked at the pages again and nodded once, decisively, and closed the ledger and handed it back to her. Then he turned to where Rowan was standing near the far wall, where he had placed himself at the beginning of the inspection, and remained, honoring his word to be present without intervening. "Mr. Mercer," Whitfield said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," Rowan said. "I have inspected food preservation operations across 4 territories in 23 years of this work," Whitfield said. He spoke with the flat, measured cadence of a man who chooses his words the way Mabel chose her salt, carefully, because excess is as damaging as deficiency. "The operation your wife has built here is among the finest I have encountered. The product quality, the process discipline, the record-keeping, all of it is of a professional standard that I do not commonly find even in established commercial operations, let alone in a 6-week-old frontier smokehouse." Rowan said nothing. He was looking at Whitfield with the controlled expression of a man who is absorbing something significant and is determined to do it without display. "I am in a position," Whitfield continued, "to offer Black Ridge Ranch a territorial supply contract. The contract would cover preserved meat supply to 8 government-serviced outposts across this territory, military, administrative, and relay stations." He paused. "The volume is substantial. The terms are favorable. The contract would be renewed annually contingent on maintained quality standards." The smokehouse was very quiet. "There is one condition," Whitfield said. He turned and he looked at Mabel, directly, with the full weight of his professional attention, the way he'd looked at the fireboxes and the brine barrels and the ledger pages. "Mrs. Mercer must remain in operational control of this facility. The contract is contingent on her continued direct management. I'll put that in writing." He said it to Rowan, but he was looking at Mabel, and Mabel stood in the center of her smokehouse. Her smokehouse. The one she had cleared and rebuilt and lit and tended and scaled from a ruin to a functioning commercial operation in 6 weeks of pre-dawn mornings and after-dark evenings, with her father's knowledge and her own discipline and the steady refusal to be diminished by the expectations of people who had looked at her and seen only what they expected to see. And she felt something that was not pride, was not vindication, was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of having done what she had always known she could do, and having the world finally arrange itself in alignment with that knowledge. Rowan stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for the conversation, or redirect it, or add his endorsement to what Whitfield had said. He simply stepped away from the wall and moved to stand beside Mabel, slightly behind her left shoulder, in the specific position of someone who is making clear, with their body rather than their words, which direction the authority in this room runs. Whitfield looked at both of them. He nodded. "I'll have the contract documents prepared and sent within the week," he said. "We'll be ready to review them," Mabel said. After Whitfield had gone, after the sound of his horse had faded down the frozen road and the smokehouse settled back into its usual sounds, the fire, the wind, the faint creak of the hanging meat in the warmth, Mabel stood at her work table with her ledger open and her pencil in her hand, but she wasn't writing. She was simply standing there, in the warmth and the smoke-scented air, with the feeling still in her chest, quieter now, but present. Rowan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the ledger, at the open page with its careful columns, and he looked at her profile. And he thought about a woman stepping off a stagecoach into a cold Montana yard with one trunk, and the absolute unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're carrying and exactly what it's worth. He thought about the things he had privately thought when he'd seen her, the doubts he had held and the assumptions he had made, not because he was a cruel man, but because he was an ordinary one, shaped by the same limited expectations that shaped most ordinary people. He thought about what it had cost her to work against those expectations, not with argument or anger, but with the quiet, relentless language of results. "Mabel," he said. She looked at him. I need you to know something, he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Stripped of the careful management he usually applied to his words, without the measured distance he maintained even when he was being kind. When you came here, I thought I was solving a problem. I thought I was being practical. I thought... He stopped, tried again. I didn't see you. I saw what I expected to see, which was not the same thing, and I am sorry for that. Mabel looked at him steadily. The smokehouse fire crackled between them. I know, she said. I see you now, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at her ledger, and she picked up her pencil, and she began to write. But the set of her shoulders was different, and the line of her mouth had changed, and Rowan, who was learning to read her the way she read her smokehouse, understood that both of those things were an answer. Outside, the winter wind moved across the frozen Montana Valley, carrying the smoke of the Black Ridge Smokehouse south and east and west, over ridgelines and across frozen rivers, into the cold air of a territory that was slowly learning the name of the woman who ran the finest preservation operation in 4 territories. The contract would arrive in 6 days. The contract arrived on a Thursday. Rowan brought it in from the road himself, having ridden out to meet the freight rider at the property line when he saw the horse coming, not because he was impatient, or not entirely because of that, but because there was something in him that wanted to carry this particular piece of paper with his own hands. He brought it to the kitchen, where Mabel was at the table with her ledger and her morning coffee, and he set it in front of her without ceremony. She looked at the envelope, then at him. Then she picked it up and opened it. The territorial supply contract from Whitfield's office was 4 pages long, written in the careful, formal language of official documents, and Mabel read every word of it with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything. Not skimming for the highlights, not jumping to the figures, but reading from the first line to the last the way her father had taught her to read any agreement, completely, because the thing that would cause you trouble was always the thing you'd decided wasn't worth reading carefully. Rowan sat across from her and drank his coffee and waited. He had learned to wait for Mabel. It was one of the more useful things he had learned in the past 2 months. She read the 4 pages. She went back and reread 1 paragraph on the 3rd page. She set the document down and picked up her pencil and made 2 small notes in the margin of her ledger. Then she looked up. It's solid, she said. There's 1 clause on page 3 about delivery liability that I want to modify before we sign. The way it's written, we assume full liability for spoilage in transit, which isn't reasonable given that we can't control conditions once the product leaves our hands. I'll write the counter language today and send it back with the writer tomorrow. Rowan looked at her. The rest of it is acceptable? The rest of it is more than acceptable, she said. She turned the document so he could see the figures on the 2nd page. This is enough to retire the Hargrove note with a single payment and still leave operating capital for the spring expansion. He had known, in the abstract, what the contract would mean financially. He had calculated it himself, roughly, after Whitfield's visit. But seeing it written in the formal columns of an official document, with figures that didn't shift or approximate but simply stated themselves with the blunt authority of completed arithmetic, seeing it across the kitchen table from the woman who had built the thing that made it possible, landed differently than calculation. He set his coffee cup down. Write the counter language, he said. I'll have the writer wait until tomorrow. She was already writing. The counter language took her an hour and a half, because she wrote it 3 times. Not because the first version was wrong, but because the first version, while legally sound, left a small ambiguity in 1 subclause that a careful reader might exploit 2 years from now, and the second version corrected the ambiguity, but introduced a slightly awkward construction that she didn't like. And the 3rd version was both precise and clean and said exactly what needed saying in the fewest words that could say it. She sent it back with the writer the following morning. Whitfield's acknowledgement arrived 4 days later. The single modified clause was accepted without objection. The contract was signed on a Tuesday in the last week of January, and the signing was witnessed by Dale Hutchins, who stood at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something that deserved more ceremony than it was receiving, but understood that the people involved were not the type to manufacture ceremony for the sake of it. When it was done, both signatures, the date, the official seal that Whitfield had sent along with his acknowledgement for exactly this purpose. Mabel closed the document cover and looked at it for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she stood, went to the stove, and started making dinner, because 22 men needed to eat, and the contract being signed didn't change that. Dale looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Dale. Neither of them said anything. But something passed between them that was the specific shared understanding of two people who have both, in their different ways, underestimated the same woman and are now living inside the consequence of being wrong about her and finding the consequence considerably better than the alternative. The news moved through the bunkhouse that evening, the way significant news always moves in close quarters. Not through any announcement, but through the particular quality of the silence at dinner, and the way Rowan sat at the head of the table with something different in the set of his shoulders, and the way Mabel moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the same unhurried efficiency she always had, but with something additional underneath it, something settled and complete. Cooper figured it out first, which was fitting, because Cooper had been wrong first and loudest, and his instinct for reading the room had sharpened considerably in the past 2 months. "Contract went through?" he said, to no one in particular, in the middle of dinner. Mabel looked at him from the kitchen doorway. "It went through," she said. The bunkhouse absorbed this in the way that ranches absorb significant information, not with celebration exactly, but with a deep collective exhale, a physical release of something that had been held for a long time. Hatch set his fork down and looked at the ceiling. Ellis pressed his lips together and blinked. Two of the younger hands exchanged a look that contained more than it showed. Dale, at the far end of the table, continued eating with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had suspected this was coming and was gratified to be right. Cooper looked at Mabel. He looked at her the way he had looked at his coffee cup on that afternoon in the kitchen when he'd read the ledger, with the direct, unguarded attention of a young man who has passed through something that changed him and is still processing the change. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. It was simple and unembellished, and it carried the full weight of everything he meant by it, which was considerably more than 2 words could technically hold. But he said it as though he trusted her to understand the rest, and she did. "Keep working," she said. "That's all the thanks I need." He nodded. He picked up his fork. Around the table the men ate, and the bunkhouse was warm. And outside, the Montana winter pressed against the walls with all its usual indifference to human struggles. And for the first time in 6 years, the walls held. The Hargrove bank note was paid in full on the 4th of February. Rowan rode into town alone to do it, which was his own private decision made without discussion, because there are some things a person needs to do in person and in silence to give them the weight they deserve. He sat across from Gerald Hargrove in the man's office, a cold, formal room that smelled of ledger paper and the particular anxiety of other people's debt. And he laid the payment on the desk in full. Hargrove looked at the amount. He looked at Rowan. Whatever he'd expected, this clearly was not it. "Paid in full," Rowan said. "I'd like the note canceled and the paperwork completed today." Hargrove looked at the payment again. "How?" he started. "Smokehouse operation," Rowan said. "Territorial supply contract. My wife runs it." Hargrove processed this information with visible difficulty, in the way that people process information that doesn't fit the categories they've built for the world. "Your wife," he said. "My wife," Rowan said. "The paperwork, Hargrove." He rode back to Black Ridge Ranch in the clear, cold February afternoon with the canceled note in his coat pocket, and the specific quality of lightness that belongs only to a man who has set down a burden he has been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it weighed. He went to the smokehouse when he got back. Mabel was at her work table, writing in the ledger, always writing in the ledger, recording, measuring, maintaining the precise and comprehensive account of the operation that was both its documentation and its conscience. She looked up when he came in. He reached into his coat and took out the canceled note and set it on the work table between them. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She looked back at it. "Paid," he said. Mabel looked at the canceled note for a long time, at the stamp across its face that extinguished the debt that had hung over this property since before she'd arrived. The debt that had driven a desperate man to advertise for a wife in a newspaper and had brought a woman with a trunk and a ledger to a dying ranch in the Montana autumn and set in motion everything that followed. She reached out and touched the edge of the document with her fingertip, lightly, the way she touched the ledger pages when she was reading something important. Then she looked up at Rowan, and her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen before. Not tears, or not only tears, but something that existed in the same register as tears, the involuntary physical expression of feeling that is too large for the body to contain entirely. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He had learned to read her, and what he read in her face in that moment was the full weight of everything she had carried from Ohio to Montana. Not just the trunk and the ledger, but the knowledge that she was capable of more than the world had ever been willing to see. And the patient, relentless determination to prove it, not through argument, but through work. And now the specific private satisfaction of a woman who has delivered exactly what she promised to a world that had not believed her capable of it. He sat down across from her. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She straightened, the brightness in her eyes settling back into its usual steadiness. "All right." He took a breath. He had rehearsed this, in the loose, internal way he rehearsed things, not word for word because he'd never been good at scripts, but in terms of what he meant and what mattered and what he didn't want to leave unsaid. "When you came here," he said, "I brought you here as a practical solution to a practical problem. I want you to know that I know that. I know what my intentions were, and I know they weren't adequate to who you are, and I've been living with that knowledge for a while now, trying to figure out how to address it." He paused. "The ranch is solvent. The operation you built is the reason. You saved 22 lives this winter. Not just from hunger, but from the kind of defeat that breaks people permanently. You did that. You did all of it." Mabel listened without interrupting. Her pencil was down. Her hands were still. "I want to ask you something," Rowan said, "and I want to be clear that whatever your answer is, nothing about this arrangement changes. Your position here, your authority over the smokehouse, any of it. This isn't conditional." He met her eyes. "Do you want to stay? Not because you have to. Not because it's practical, but because you want to." The smokehouse was very quiet. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the work table between them, at the ledger with its dense, careful pages, at the canceled note lying on its surface, at her pencil and her cup of tea and the small practical tools of the work she had come here to do. She looked at the fireboxes, both of them burning low and steady, and at the hanging cuts above them that represented weeks of labor and the knowledge of 3 generations of her family. She looked at the walls she had scraped and sealed, the door Dale had built to her measurements, the vents she had adjusted by fractions of an inch until the draw was exactly right. She thought about her father and the ledger and the years of learning that had brought her to this specific moment in this specific place. She thought about what he had said to her, more than once, in the patient way he said the things that mattered. The work will take you where you're supposed to go. Follow the work. She had followed the work. It had brought her here. To this ranch, this smokehouse, this man sitting across the work table from her asking a question that was, in its way, the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." Rowan exhaled slowly. He nodded once, the same decisive nod she had learned to read as his version of deep feeling contained in small expression. "Good," he said. She picked up her pencil. He did not immediately leave. He stayed at the work table, and she was aware of him there. His presence, which had changed in quality over the past months from something cautious and maintained to something warmer and easier, the presence of a person who has stopped performing and started simply being. And they sat together in the warmth of the double fireboxes while the February cold pressed against the walls outside and held no power over anything inside. After a while, Rowan said, "The spring expansion. I've been thinking about it," she said without looking up. "So have I." He reached across the table and turned the ledger toward him, looking at the page she'd been working on. "You've been thinking about a 3rd firebox and a proper curing room attached to the east wall," she said. "Temperature-controlled storage. If we build it before the thaw, we can be operational by April." She pointed to a sketch in the margin, the addition she'd drawn in during the quiet hours, the structure that lived in her mind fully formed and was waiting only for the season to allow it. Dale could build it. He'd need help, but Cooper's been watching the stonework. He could handle the firebox. Rowan looked at the sketch. He turned the ledger slightly, examining it from a different angle. "How long to build?" 6 weeks if the weather cooperates. 8 if it doesn't. "We'll start in March," he said. She took the ledger back and turned to a fresh page and wrote March, curing room construction at the top, and beneath it began the list of materials, and Rowan leaned forward slightly to read over her shoulder as she wrote, and neither of them remarked on the closeness because it had stopped requiring remark. The weeks that followed had a quality that none of the people living through them could have described precisely, but all of them felt. A quality of forward motion, of things accumulating rather than depleting, of work done in the knowledge that it was building towards something rather than merely holding off collapse. The contracts with Garrett and Bryce continued, the deliveries going out on schedule, the product consistent in quality because Mabel did not allow inconsistency and had by this point trained the operation to reflect that standard at every stage. The distribution arrangement with Aldridge proved its value in March, when a late-season storm made direct delivery impossible for 10 days, and the freight network absorbed the disruption without breaking the supply chain. Mabel noted this in her ledger with the same brevity she applied to everything. March 14th to 24th, storm delay. Aldridge Network maintained delivery schedule, arrangement functioning as designed. The curing room construction began on the 5th of March, when the worst of the winter had passed, but the ground was still cold enough to work stone without the complications that came with the thaw. Cooper handled the firebox stonework with a careful, almost exaggerated precision that Dale observed without comment, understanding without being told that the young man was doing something deliberate, building something with his hands in the place he had once thought he understood and had discovered he had not understood at all. It took 7 weeks. When it was finished, Mabel walked through it with her lantern and her ledger, checking every dimension, every joint, every surface, every vent and fitting and threshold. She was in there for 45 minutes. The men waited outside in the April morning light with the specific, calibrated patience of people who have learned that her assessments cannot be hurried, and that hurrying them produces only a longer assessment. She came out. She looked at Cooper, who was standing near the doorway with his hands in his pockets and a studied expression of not caring that fooled no one. "It's right," she said. Cooper looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at the curing room and then back at the ground, and he nodded once, and the relief and the pride moved across his face too quickly to hide, which he didn't try to. "Good," he said. By the time April came fully to the valley, Black Ridge Ranch was unrecognizable as the dying operation that had greeted Mabel Holloway the previous autumn. Not in its physical structures, which were the same structures, same barn, same bunkhouse, same main house, but in the quality of the place, in the way it occupied the land, in the evidence of sustained purpose visible in every corner of it. The cold store was organized and fully stocked. The new curing room stood solid against the east wall of the smokehouse, its stonework tight and clean. The ledger on Mabel's work table had grown by a third, its new pages dense with the record of a winter survived and a spring begun in earnest. One evening in mid-April, a quiet evening, the air finally carrying the first real warmth of the season, the mountains to the west still white, but the valley floor soft and beginning to green, Rowan came to the kitchen after dinner and sat down across from Mabel, and he set something on the table between them. It was a document, not a contract this time. Something different, a legal document, its language formal and precise, bearing the seals of the county and the territorial authority. Mabel looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. She read the heading from across the table. Property and Partnership Agreement. Black Ridge Ranch. She looked at Rowan. "I had it drawn up last week," he said. His voice was even, but underneath it was the particular quality she had come to associate with the moments when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time and was choosing his words with unusual care. "Equal partnership, equal ownership, your name on the deed beside mine." He paused. "Not because the contract requires it, or because it's practical, because it's right." Mabel looked at the document. She reached out and turned it toward herself and read it. Completely, carefully, the way she read everything. It took her a while. Rowan waited. When she finished, she looked up. "You had a lawyer draw this," she said. "Rode to Helena for it," he said. "Took 3 days." She looked at him, at the face that had changed in the months she'd known it, that she had learned to read the way she read smoke and salt and temperature, as a system with its own logic and its own specific vocabulary. The lines of caution that had been so prominent in autumn had not disappeared, but something warmer lived alongside them now, something that had been allowed to surface once the long, exhausting project of holding everything together alone had been shared between two people instead of borne by one. She thought about her father again, the last conversation she'd had with him, near the end, when he was already ill and she had sat beside his chair in the evening, and he had held the ledger in his lap and looked at it with the tired but satisfied expression of a man reviewing work he was proud of. "This goes with you," he had said. "All of it goes with you. And wherever you use it, that place becomes yours." She understood now what he had meant, not in the legal sense, though the document in front of her addressed that too, but in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered more, the sense in which a place belongs to you because you have poured yourself into it, because you have built something within it that wouldn't exist without you, because it carries the mark of your knowledge and your labor and your willingness to keep going. When keeping going was the hardest available option, Black Ridge Ranch was hers. It had been hers since the morning she lit the first fire in the restored smokehouse and watched the smoke climb into the October sky. The document simply made the rest of the world agree. She picked up her pencil. "Give me your pen," she said. He reached into his coat and produced the pen he'd brought for exactly this purpose. She noticed that, filed it quietly, felt the small warmth of it, and she signed her name on the line beside his, in her clear, deliberate hand, the hand that had never learned to shake. Mabel Holloway Mercer, co-owner, Black Ridge Ranch, April, 1884. She set the pen down and looked at what she'd written. Rowan took the document and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, close to where the canceled banknote had ridden the day he'd paid off the debt. He would put it with the ranch papers tonight, in the locked box in the study, where it would stay, legal, permanent, a fact of record as solid as the stone fireboxes in the smokehouse. "Rowan," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "What you planned for it when you first came here, what you wanted it to be." He looked at her, surprised by the question, surprised that she was asking, and surprised to find that the answer was still alive in him, underneath 6 years of difficulty, intact in a way he hadn't known until this moment. He told her about the original vision, the scale of the cattle operation he'd imagined, the land he'd hoped to acquire, the kind of sustainable, self-sufficient ranch that would still be standing 100 years on. He told her about the setbacks, each one, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has processed a grief to its conclusion and can now speak of it without being consumed. He told her about the morning he'd realized the Hargrove note might end everything, and the particular quality of despair that had come with that realization. Not the sharp pain of sudden loss, but the slow, grinding exhaustion of a person who has been fighting a losing battle and knows it. Mabel listened without interrupting. She sat with her hands around her teacup and her eyes on him, and she simply listened, the way she had always listened, with full attention, without performance, without planning her response while he was still speaking. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "The cattle operation is still possible," she said. "The revenue from the smokehouse, sustained over 2 years, would give you the capital to expand the herd without debt exposure. If you build the herd incrementally—" She reached for her ledger, and he put his hand over hers gently to stop her. She looked at him. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight we just sit here." She looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face. Then she set the pencil down and left the ledger closed, and they sat at the kitchen table in the warm April evening, and through the window the valley was softening in the last light, the mountains turning rose and gold at their peaks, the land that had nearly broken him and had instead been rebuilt by the woman sitting across from him, looking out at it with those quick, quiet eyes that had seen it clearly from the first moment she'd arrived. Summer came to the valley with a generosity that felt, after the severity of that winter, almost excessive. Long warm days, afternoon thunderstorms that moved through quickly and left the air clean and the grass brilliantly green, the creek running full again between banks that had been locked in ice 4 months ago. The smokehouse operation ran through the warm months at a reduced but steady pace, building stock for the autumn orders, and Mabel spent part of each day in the kitchen garden she had laid out in the south yard in March. A proper kitchen garden, designed with the same methodical precision as everything else she did, yielding vegetables in quantities that supplemented the ranch's provisions and reduced their dependence on freight supply for staples. The men helped her plant it, which had also not been anyone's deliberate decision, but had simply happened one morning when she was out in the south yard with her stakes and string, and several of the hands had drifted over and asked what they could do, and she had told them, and they had done it. Hatch, who had been on this ranch for 11 years and had seen several owners come and go, planted 3 rows of carrots that morning with a focused care that was entirely out of proportion to the task and entirely in keeping with the feeling that had settled over the whole ranch since winter. The feeling of people who are building something that will last and know it, and bring that knowledge to every small task as much as the large ones. One morning in July, Rowan came out to the smokehouse to find Mabel standing in the open doorway, not working, not writing, just standing there looking out at the ranch in the morning light. It was unusual enough that he stopped when he saw her, not wanting to interrupt something he couldn't identify. She heard him and turned, and she was smiling. Not the small, contained acknowledgement that was her usual expression of something positive, but a real smile, wide and unguarded, the kind that transforms a face. "What is it?" he asked. She looked out at the ranch again, at the yard where Ellis was crossing with a bucket, at the garden in the south, at the repaired fence line running straight and clean along the north boundary, at the bunkhouse from which the sound of conversation and occasional laughter drifted through the warm morning air. "My father used to say," she said, "that you know a smokehouse is truly alive when you stop thinking about whether it will fail and start thinking about what you'll do with it next." She paused. "I've been standing here trying to think of a problem, and I can't find one." Rowan came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked out at the same morning she was looking at. "That's a good problem to have," he said. "It's not a problem at all," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He looked at her. She was still smiling. After a moment, he smiled too. The same slow, rare smile she had first seen at the Sulphur Creek delivery, and had seen perhaps a dozen times since, always unexpected, always genuine. The smile of a man who had largely forgotten he was capable of it, and is periodically surprised to discover he still is. They stood together in the doorway of the smokehouse in the July morning, with the whole of the rebuilt ranch spread out before them, and the smoke rising thin and straight into the clear Montana sky. And everything that had been broken and saved and built and signed and planted and tended and argued over and negotiated and learned and recorded in that worn, precious ledger was present in that moment, not as a history, but as a living thing, as the ground they were standing on, as the air they were breathing, as the work that lay ahead of them and that neither of them was afraid of. The frontier would remember Black Ridge Ranch for a long time, not for its cattle, in the end, though the herd grew in the years that followed and the operation expanded as Mabel had calculated it could. Not for the hardship of that winter, though the hardship was real. It would remember it for the smokehouse, for the thin, pale ribbon of smoke that had risen from a restored ruin on a cold October morning and kept rising through winter and spring and summer and every season after, carrying with it the smell of hickory and patience and the particular indelible scent of knowledge put to its full purpose. And people in the valley, when they spoke of it later, would speak of the woman who had seen what no one else had seen, and done what no one else had believed she could do, and saved 22 men from a winter that would have broken them, and built from the ruins of an abandoned smokehouse something that outlasted every expectation and every doubt and every careless judgment made by people who had looked at her and seen only what they expected. They would remember that she had arrived with one trunk and a dead man's ledger. They would remember that she had never once argued about what she was capable of. They would remember that she had simply, and without apology, shown them. The smokehouse burned for 30 years after that first October fire. The ledger was added to every season, its pages growing dense with the accumulated knowledge of a life fully applied, until it was a different object than the one she'd carried across half the country. Thicker, more worn, more alive, as all things are when they have been genuinely used. And on the cover, in the careful hand that had never learned to shake, the name that appeared on the deed of Black Ridge Ranch, equal and permanent and belonging completely to the woman who had earned it, Mabel Holloway Mercer, the woman who saved them all.